Hello and welcome to another video lecture from Mr. Watkins at mrwatkins.com. This video lecture is focused specifically on IB topic 4.3, the carbon cycle, and a very specific application, and that is the application is the analysis of data from air monitoring stations to explain annual fluctuations. Now, because of where this application is put under the carbon cycle, I believe that that's basically what the IB people are going to be testing you about. They're going to be giving you a graph showing over a year how the amount of carbon dioxide that we see in the atmosphere changes. Now, there's certainly other air pollutants, other molecules in the air that we monitor. Nitrogen dioxide is one of them, and those do tend to have a fluctuation over the course of the year, but I really feel like it's going to be CO2. So let's get started, and what we're going to first look at is the carbon cycle. I mean, we have to understand, how does carbon dioxide get into the atmosphere, how does it get out of the atmosphere, and that's what we need to know first before we can start to explain why there would be fluctuations in the amount of carbon dioxide maybe over a course of a year. So let's start off with that first piece. And we just need to go back to some previously covered material, and that is we look at CO2. How does CO2 get out of the atmosphere? What organisms use CO2? And that's very straightforward. It's plants and other photosynthetic organisms. So photosynthesis basically pulls CO2 out of the atmosphere. You could almost say, in fact we do say, that forest, major grasslands, those kind of things are what we call carbon sinks. They pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Now, that organism that basically makes its own food is called an autotroph, and that organism is a producer. And what we're talking about producing is glucose, or another sugar, and we're going to focus and just leave it at glucose. Remember that glucose has a chemical formula of C6H12O6, and so there's your carbon right there in that C6. So plants are going to pull, or photosynthetic organisms are going to pull the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and use that to generate a sugar. And they can use that to make cellulose for cell walls, to help build it. They can store it as starch. But then a consumer comes along, and then that consumer is going to eat that plant, or eat that organism that does photosynthesis, and take in that glucose. And we're going to break it down. We're going to combust the glucose in a process called cellular respiration. And if you remember, cellular respiration releases carbon dioxide. We give off carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. And so there's this cycle of pulling the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and then dumping that carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere that has been going on for a long, long time here on this planet. Now, that's not just the only way that carbon dioxide gets into the atmosphere. Certainly you have decomposers, things that take dead matter and basically go through the process of breaking that dead matter down, and in that process, carbon dioxide is released. So you have things like fungi and some bacteria that will break down these dead and decaying organisms, and carbon dioxide, they will give off carbon dioxide as a byproduct, and that gets more carbon dioxide back in the atmosphere. Another big contributor is the burning of fossil fuels, the burning of organics that have been placed in the earth, such as gas. Around here we've got the Bartlett Shale. We're pulling the gas out of the ground. We're going to burn that gas, and that process of combustion releases, among other things, carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And so there's a human component that's adding in carbon dioxide into this equation. But our focus here is not so much on how that works and why we're all having that go on. We just want to make sure we understand some very basics of how carbon dioxide gets into the atmosphere. So why do we see the fluctuations? Well, let's kind of think about this. Let's look at this circle here and see what's going on. And organisms that pull it out of the pull the carbon dioxide, out of the atmosphere do photosynthesis. But what happens when fall hits? What happens when winter time comes? And a lot of organisms, especially around here, just flat stop doing photosynthesis, or they minimize it so much that they're not pulling a lot of carbon dioxide out. So when you look at the winter months, when photosynthesis has decreased, you're going to see an increase in carbon dioxide. And the reason why you're going to see an increase in carbon dioxide again is because we're just not pulling it. The plants, the photosynthetic organisms, are just not pulling it out of the atmosphere. And so we see a buildup. So we're going to see higher levels of carbon dioxide in the air. Now, not all plants stop doing photosynthesis. Certainly there's a little bit of a decrease. We see shorter days as we get closer and closer to the end of December, but there's enough of a decrease. In fact, there's a lot of plants that don't do it, that we see a huge difference there in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere compared to, say, summertime. So basically, you should see some kind of cycle that when spring hits and the plants come out of the hibernation, if you will, come back to life, start producing leaves, start increasing the amount of photosynthesis they do, we should see a decrease then in CO2 in the atmosphere because photosynthesis is wrapped back up. The plants are starting to pull more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So your spring and your summer months should show a decrease, and then your fall and your winter should show an increase in carbon dioxide. Now, not only do we see that, and this would be a seasonal fluctuation, but we also are going to see that as we move, say, from the equator up to the northern or the southern latitudes. And so you have a latitudinal difference. Hopefully I can spell this right. So you have a latitudinal fluctuation, and again, think about it. As you move from here in the southern part of the United States, and you move north, and you get up into Canada, and all the way up into Alaska, you're going to see a decrease in the amount of photosynthetic organisms, especially when you look at your winter months, because it's just so cold. And so we don't see the process that the organisms go through doesn't have those long a growing season, doesn't have has a lot longer dormancy. And so when you look at things like, just look in Alaska, and you look at the amount of carbon dioxide and how much it fluctuates on a seasonal level in Alaska is going to be a lot greater than it would be, say, here in Texas or even further south in Central America. And again, it's just because of the amount of photosynthesis. Now let's talk about plants. Let's talk about the oceans and water and terrestrial environments. We also see a difference between land, a terrestrial environment, and, say, the ocean. There's a little different system that's going on in the ocean. We do get some dissolved carbon dioxide into the ocean, but there's not as big a fluctuation in temperature in ocean water. It certainly can fluctuate, but we don't see it like we do on land, and we have a lot more organisms on land that are doing photosynthesis, and so we generally see this change in or the fluctuation, excuse me, to be greater on land than we do see it occurring in the water or over water. So this is basically what we're looking at. To try to explain these fluctuations over a course of a year, you want to be sure that you talk about the fact that we have this system in place, that photosynthesis, and cellular respiration for that matter, is a driving force, particularly photosynthesis, in these fluctuations. That in fall and winter, when photosynthesis decreases, dramatically decreases, we're leaving more oxygen in the atmosphere, so we see an increase in CO2. Whereas in the spring and summer, when the plants come back and start really ramping up their photosynthesis so that they can produce the fruits, they can do the job they need to build up the amount of sugars they have, we'll see a decrease in CO2 simply because the plants are converting that into carbon dioxide. That's it for this time. We'll see you next time.